Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. My name is Paul Johnson, and I have been representing the defendant, Mr. Waldman. I'm sure that all of you, at some time, have either played or familiar with the game of Clue. In this game, there are multiple characters. There are a number of rooms: the kitchen, the dining room, the study, the conservatory. And there are also different weapons: the rope, the wrench, the candlestick. And the point of the game, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is to go around and to find out who done it. Who was killed, what room did it happen, and what was the weapon that was used. And that is remarkably similar to different elements in this case before you today. That there has been a crime actually been committed, and even though this is a civil trial, that there is different elements that need to be considered. And the same three elements in the game of Clue should is a good roadmap to what we need to talk about this morning, ladies and gentlemen, about this case. Let's consider each part: the room, the person, and the weapon. Now, the room is the easiest part. It is undisputed that the altercation took place on Evergreen Avenue, a one-way street lined with cars. So we'll not spend any time to think about that. Let's think about the people in this case. There was three involved: Mr. Waldman, Mr. Levy, Mr. Waldman's partner, and Mr. Ramirez. Now, Mr. Waldman has been a police officer on the Chicago Police Force for the last 8 years. He has worked his way up through the ranks, starting off as a uniformed police officer, basic patrol, an plainclothes warrant officer issuing warrants to people and interacting with the public, and finally now in the somewhat prestigious position as a plainclothes officer in the anti-crime unit, to ferret out crime, to go undercover, to find where the criminals are at. So obviously his superiors believe that he's a competent and trustworthy man. And while it may be true he may have taken a while to figure out what he wanted to do in life and went to different cities, he's been of the most upright stature and character in the last few years. But let's think about Mr. Ramirez in the night in question. On that night, Mr. Ramirez had a few friends over, had a couple beers. Then they decided to go out, where they went to one bar. He had partook of some scotch and water. And then they decided to go to another bar where he had a couple more drinks and had a couple more scotches and water. Now, according to the Illinois driving book, Rules of the Road, Chapter 6, talks about what driving under the influence, DUI, is. And just one drink, a 12-ounce beer, a 5-ounce wine, or a 1.5 shot of hard liquor will put someone pretty much borderline with the legal limit. Now, Mr. Ramirez had 7 drinks during the course of the evening. Granted that some time has passed and some of it has burned off, but pretty much scientifically we can say with certainty that he had about 2 to 3 ounces of hard liquor rushing through his veins when he encountered Mr. Waldman. Now, the plaintiff would like you to think that it was the police that were the aggressors. But let's think about this for a minute here. It was Mr. Ramirez that chose to have alcohol that night. It was Mr. Ramirez that initiated the contact with the police. It was Mr. Ramirez that, in fact, attacked Mr. Levy. That it started with a shouting match, escalated. Mr. Ramirez grabs Mr. Levy and shoves him up against the car. And then he takes out this, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the weapon. Now that's the third element of this case. We've talked about the location and the people. Let's think about this weapon for a minute. A pocket knife. Now, the plaintiff has really denied any knowledge of this weapon at all. But it still does not make it so that he did not have it. In fact, Mr. Ramirez took out this knife, held it in his hand, and stabbed Mr. Levy with it in the right shoulder. In fact, there is an official medical report from Cook County Hospital where Mr. Levy's right shoulder was treated for a cut wound. Now, how did he sustain this cut if a knife was not in play? Mr. Ramirez had the knife. He stabbed Mr. Waldman. He had him up against the car. Mr. Levy had his hand up against Mr. Ramirez's wrist. It broke. The knife was going to come down to stab him again. Mr. Waldman, not wanting to stand by and watch his fellow police officer get attacked and beaten up by a half-drunk idiot, jumps out of the car, draws his revolver. Now, it may be argued that it was not prudent for Mr. Waldman to shoot him, but in this particular instance, it was a difference between a bullet and a body bag. The difference between Mr. Ramirez being injured or Mr. Levy dying. Mr. Waldman, in the split second, felt it was necessary to shoot a single bullet, only once, into the shoulder to disarm Mr. Ramirez, which occurred and which happened. The knife fell, and the injuries that Mr. Ramirez suffered were simply the effects of attacking Mr. Levy. I'd like to look about this knife one moment, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. The defense has pointed out, plaintiff, that the knife was closed, there was no blood, no fingerprints. But think with me for a minute here, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Is it too much to expect that Mr. Ramirez wiped the blade clean? While he's laying there, I think it would pass through his mind. You know, if they find this open blood knife with my fingerprints all over it, that's not going to look very good in my defense. While Mr. Waldman was off waiting for help and Mr. Levy was distracted with his shoulder wound, Mr. Ramirez had the time, the motive, and the ability to clean the knife, to close it, and to leave it laying there when it was found. Also, Mr. Ramirez was half drunk and acting not so smart. He could have possibly only have opened the knife partway, partially stabbed him, which would explain the non-severity of the knife wound somewhat, and was preparing to do it again, and looked to Mr. Waldman that he was going to severely injure him, giving him the ability and the rationale to shoot Mr. Ramirez. And then the knife fell and closed on its impact down, and then Mr. Ramirez simply wiped it clean before it was recovered by the police. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it's quite simple. Mr. Waldman was performing his official duties when Mr. Ramirez inexplicably and for no reason attacked Mr. Levy. Mr. Ramirez is now asking you, the members of the jury, for money to compensate him for these activities. But it is he who is the aggressor in the situation. It is he who has attacked a uniformed police officer. To give money and to compensate Mr. Ramirez is simply to incite and embolden the lower basis instincts of our community, to incite other people like him and worse to attack and to injure police officers and then come into court and get thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars from juries. To reward him and to give him money is to simply to reward and to compliment him for his bad and childish behavior. The plaintiff has made it sound like he will be right and just to compensate him for his injuries. But to do so is to simply to reward bad behavior, to encourage more of this ceaseless violence against the brave men and women that protect you. They protect you against the murderers, the rapists, the muggers, and the scumbags that want to break into your house. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to find for the defendant, Mr. Waldman, and not to reward Mr. Ramirez for his bad acts.